He had walked the streets of Harvard Square. He had watched American factories roar like mechanical cities, and he had studied the faces of American workers who seemed to move with a confidence that came from a nation rich in steel, oil, and limitless ambition. Long before the Pacific erupted in flames, Isoroku Yamamoto understood something his own government refused to see. He knew that if Japan ever forced America into a total war, the outcome would not be decided by courage, tradition, or even strategy. It would be decided by industry. Yamamoto had spent years studying in the United States, and during those years, he absorbed everything he could about America. He saw the ease with which Americans produced ships by the dozen, cars by the millions, and aircraft with a kind of industrial rhythm no Asian nation could match at the time. He knew the American spirit was unpredictable, friendly on the surface, but capable of incredible fury when attacked. And so, even as he served the Japanese Empire, he carried a truth inside him like an unspoken warning. America was not a sleeping giant. It was an awakened colossus pretending to sleep. When the Japanese government drifted toward war, Yamamoto found himself trapped between his duty and his intellect. He opposed the invasion of China. He opposed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. And most of all, he opposed the idea that Japan could win a long war against the United States. He had run the numbers. He had toured the factories. He had watched assembly lines that never stopped, powered by a nation with more natural resources than Japan could hope to control. The Japanese High Command believed spirit could defeat steel. Yamamoto knew otherwise, yet he also understood the iron law of military service. You may warn, you may argue, you may protest, but when the order comes, you obey. And so as Japan moved closer to conflict, Yamamoto began planning the only strategy he believed gave his country even the slightest chance. If war was unavoidable, then Japan must strike so hard and so suddenly that the American people would lose the will to fight. It would need to be a blow so devastating that negotiations might follow before American industry fully awakened. That was the tragic logic behind the future attack on Pearl Harbor. It was not an act of confidence, it was an act of desperation. While he served abroad, Yamamoto saw Americans with a clarity few Japanese officers possessed, in smoky billiard halls, in naval academies, in bustling streets of Washington, D.C. He observed the culture in motion. Americans argued loudly but united quickly. They complained constantly but worked relentlessly. They were individualistic yet patriotic in a way that was difficult to predict. He once remarked that Americans were a people who could be friendly rivals one day and unstoppable enemies the next. He also knew their industrial potential was not theoretical. It was real, measurable, and gigantic. Japan, by contrast, was constrained by geography. It had limited oil, limited steel, and limited capacity for long-term manufacturing. It imported nearly all the raw materials needed for war. Even with its skilled engineers and disciplined workforce, Japan could not outbuild a nation whose factories could produce more steel in a week than Japan could in a month. Yamamoto had studied the mathematics of war production and concluded that Japan's best pilots, best ships, and bravest soldiers would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer American output. Still, as tensions rose across the Pacific, nationalism and military pride drowned out his warnings. Many Japanese leaders dismissed America as soft, too wealthy, too spoiled, too divided to fight. They believed that a surprise attack would break American resolve. They believed America would negotiate. They believed America feared war. Yamamoto, who had learned the American mindset firsthand, knew how wrong that assumption was. If anything, he feared Pearl Harbor would unite Americans in a way Japan would regret for generations. He famously wrote that for 6 months after the start of hostilities, he could run wild and achieve victory. But after that, if the war dragged on, he had no expectation of success. Those were not words of arrogance. They were a forecast grounded in factory output, steel tonnage, oil reserves, and industrial capacity. He knew that war was not simply fought in the sky or at sea. War was fought in assembly lines, in foundries, in shipyards, and in the relentless production of machines that could replace every loss. During his time in America, Yamamoto visited shipyards where vessels seemed to rise from steel plates overnight. He toured automobile plants where machines stamped metal with incredible speed, turning raw materials into perfectly shaped components. He watched railroads move goods from coast to coast with a rhythm Japan could not match. He dined with American officers who spoke casually of resources and fuel reserves so enormous that Japan's entire wartime supply seemed like a bucket beside a river. He understood that the American advantage was not merely industrial, it was cultural. Americans valued innovation, embraced experimentation, and possessed an almost limitless confidence in their ability to solve problems. If a ship was too slow, they redesigned it. If an aircraft lacked range, they re-engineered it. If a factory fell behind, they built another. It was a system driven by individual creativity but supported by national unity during times of crisis. As Japan continued its path toward confrontation, Yamamoto tried one last time to persuade his superiors of the danger. He warned them that a war with America would not resemble Japan's earlier victories in Asia. It would be a war of attrition fought on a continental scale, and Japan did not have the resources to sustain such a conflict. His warnings, however, were interpreted as defeatism. Some even accused him of being too fond of the West. In truth, he was not admiring America, he was acknowledging reality. When the decision for war was finally made, Yamamoto committed himself fully. He believed that if Japan must fight, then it must fight with absolute precision and maximum early advantage. He planned the attack on Pearl Harbor not out of confidence, but out of a strategic attempt to buy Japan time. He also hoped, quietly, that the shock of the attack might force America into negotiations. But deep inside, he feared the opposite. He feared that Pearl Harbor would unleash an American fury unlike anything Japan had ever faced. As 1941 unfolded, Japan's leaders boasted of their fleet, their pilots, and their technological prowess. Yamamoto remained silent. He knew Japan's aircraft carriers were powerful, but they were limited in number. He knew Japan's pilot training was elite, but irreplaceable. He knew Japan's navy was disciplined, but dependent on fuel that Japan did not have. And he knew that America, even if caught off guard, could replace every ship, every plane, and every loss with frightening speed. This was the core of his warning. Japan might win early battles, but America would win the war. And so the tragedy continued to unfold, a tragedy rooted in ignored warnings, misunderstood cultures, and a belief that spirit alone could defeat industry. Yamamoto's time in America had shown him that the United States possessed an industrial might that could shift the balance of world power. He had seen it with his own eyes, measured it with his own mind, and feared it with his entire strategic being. As the countdown to Pearl Harbor approached, Yamamoto felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He was preparing to unleash a strike that would ignite the Pacific. But he also knew that beyond that strike, beyond the smoke, beyond the temporary victories, beyond the cheers of his own nation, waited a future shaped not by daring raids, but by relentless American production. And he feared, more than anything, that Japan was marching toward a war it could not win. Yamamoto had spent more than 6 years in the United States, and those years shaped him in ways the Japanese leadership never fully understood. When he walked the streets of San Francisco, he felt the pulse of a society that thrived on competition but united in moments of crisis. When he observed American factories, he saw a nation capable of turning its industrial might into a tidal wave of steel, oil, and machinery. And when he watched American workers leave their jobs at sunset, he sensed a country that fought hard, lived freely, and believed passionately in defending its way of life. It was this understanding that haunted him as Japan pushed itself into confrontation with a nation far larger, wealthier, and more productive. To Yamamoto, war against America was not a matter of tactics or bravery. It was a matter of mathematics and destiny. Even the most brilliant strategy could not overcome the sheer scale of American resources. And yet, as 1941 approached, the Japanese military leadership convinced itself that a swift strike would cripple the United States and force it to negotiate. They wanted a dramatic blow, a symbol of strength, something to shock Washington into submission. But Yamamoto knew differently. He knew Americans did not break that easily. He'd watched them recover from earthquakes, economic crises, and internal conflicts. He had seen the resilience of a people who rebuilt faster than most nations could destroy. That knowledge became the core of his warning. Japan might win dramatic victories at first, but if the war lasted longer than 6 months to a year, defeat was inevitable. But his warnings were not welcomed. The militarists saw him as overly cautious, too impressed by the West, too influenced by his time abroad, and too hesitant to follow Japan's nationalist ambitions. They wanted expansion across the Pacific. They wanted dominance in East Asia. They wanted a war that Yamamoto knew Japan could not win. And yet, as commander of the fleet, he was expected to deliver results, not doubts. So Yamamoto devised a plan. If Japan was to go to war with the United States, then the only way to succeed was to deal a blow so devastating, so paralyzing, that the Americans would hesitate before committing their full power. That plan became the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a bold strategy, driven as much by desperation as brilliance. Yamamoto knew the attack could buy time, but he also knew it was not enough to secure victory. When the attack came on December 7th, 1941, the world changed instantly. Japan struck with fury, crippling battleships, destroying aircraft, and stunning the American public. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Yamamoto's gamble had paid off. Japan had won the opening move, and its military seized territories across the Pacific with lightning speed. But even in those triumphant days, Yamamoto was not celebrating. When news arrived that the attack had succeeded, when officers cheered and newspapers declared victory, Yamamoto remained silent. He understood what was coming. He understood what the sleeping giant meant. In the weeks that followed, factories across the United States surged to life. Workers filled assembly lines. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. American shipyards began launching vessels at an unprecedented pace, sometimes completing a destroyer in just weeks and a Liberty ship in a matter of days. The scale was unimaginable. Japan was producing dozens of planes per month. America would soon produce thousands. As Yamamoto predicted, the war evolved into a contest Japan could not match. The United States, driven by anger, unity, and industrial might, shifted from defense to relentless offense. New carriers were built, new aircraft designed, new strategies adopted. While Japan struggled to replace experienced pilots and maintain its fuel supplies, America expanded its training programs, increased its logistical support, and opened new fronts across the Pacific. Yamamoto saw it happening in real time. He watched reports that detailed the growing strength of the United States. He saw the numbers: aircraft built, ships launched, troops trained, and he knew Japan was slipping toward the outcome he had warned about years before. The tide was turning, slowly but unmistakably. By 1942, the Battle of Midway became the first major proof of Yamamoto's fears. 4 Japanese carriers were lost, and with them, many of the best pilots Japan had left. It was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. The United States had struck back with precision and daring, proving that it would not be easily subdued. That defeat marked the beginning of the long retreat Yamamoto dreaded. Yet even then, Yamamoto continued to shoulder responsibility with dignity and resolve. He visited frontline airfields, encouraged pilots, and emphasized discipline and courage. He knew morale mattered. He knew that even in the face of overwhelming odds, Japan needed leaders who stood with their men, not above them. But fate had another turn in store. In 1943, American codebreakers intercepted information about Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour in the Solomon Islands. The United States launched Operation Vengeance, a carefully planned mission to intercept and shoot down the aircraft carrying the very man whose insight they respected, even if he was their enemy. When his plane was attacked and crashed into the jungles of Bougainville, it marked the symbolic end of Japan's strategic vision. The man who understood the war best was gone, leaving behind leaders who still believed victory was possible despite all evidence to the contrary. His death was a seismic moment in Japan. Soldiers wept, naval officers vowed revenge, and the Japanese government hid the news for weeks, fearing the blow to national morale. But in the United States, even among military circles, there was quiet respect. Yamamoto had been an adversary, but he was also a strategist of remarkable depth, a man who tried to prevent a war he knew would bring devastation. In the final years of the war, everything Yamamoto predicted became reality. American bombers dominated the skies. Carrier groups advanced island by island. Japanese cities were firebombed, supply lines were severed, and the Imperial Navy, once feared across the Pacific, was reduced to scattered remnants. By 1945, Japan faced the full might of a nation Yamamoto had warned not to provoke. And yet, his legacy did not end with defeat. In the years after the war, historians began to understand the rare perspective Yamamoto brought to Japan's leadership. He had seen the United States not as an abstract enemy, but as a powerful, determined nation capable of unimaginable mobilization. He respected its people. He admired its industry. He recognized its strengths long before the war began. His warnings were not signs of weakness. They were signs of wisdom. Yamamoto remains a complex figure, a loyal Japanese admiral who opposed war with America, yet led the attack that brought the United States into the conflict. A strategist who delivered one of history's most shocking surprise attacks, yet knew it would eventually fail. A man who loved his country, but understood the world beyond it more clearly than most of his peers. And ultimately, his story is a reminder that war is not simply fought with weapons or battleships, but with an understanding of one's enemy, one's resources, and one's limits. Yamamoto understood all three. His tragedy was that few in power listened. Today, his warnings echo through history. They capture the tension between ambition and reality, pride and pragmatism. He stands as an example of a leader who understood that true strength lies not in seeking war, but in recognizing when war cannot be won. And as the world looks back on the Pacific War, Yamamoto's voice still carries through the decades. A voice shaped by experience, sharpened by insight, and made unforgettable by the very war he tried to prevent. The Luftwaffe was being outnumbered, outbuilt, and outlasted, and no amount of courage or sacrifice could change that. He turned his aircraft toward home, the distant sound of bombs echoing behind him, knowing that tomorrow the sky would look exactly the same, and the day after that.